Hey, everybody out there in the Google, YouTube, interweb universe. Tom Lynn here with Julian Jason Haladyn, who's been good enough to join us today to discuss, among other things, his recently published book from Zero Books, Julian Jason Haladyn, who's today to discuss, among other things, his recent from Zero Books. Sorry, I lost you there, Julian. Boredom and Art, Passions and the Will to Boredom.
Hello.
And why don't we start, Julian? I don't think I actually asked you this question last time. We actually did this as an interview a little while ago, but the audio was unfortunate, so he was kind enough to do another one. But to open with this question, what is boredom? You know, because it's a word we use some frequency. It might be sort of akin to time. Everybody knows what it is until you start talking about it. I don't think it's necessarily as acute of a case as a question of time. But how do you deal with that basic point of departure? What is boredom?
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting question. I've had to, in my own research, I had in a sense divide boredom up into two different parts. There's kind of a colloquial boredom, an everyday boredom that most of us experience at some level or another. Just being bored with something as you walk down the street or that you experience. And then there's a different sense of boredom, and I wouldn't consider one greater than the other in any capacity, but there's a sense of boredom as something that is a little bit more pervasive in the way that you think and the way that you experience life. And so in that capacity, boredom becomes this condition in which it's hard to find meaning in things. And so when you experience anything, you have, again, a hard time seeing the meaning in it, seeing the meaning for yourself and for any kind of larger question. So those are the two. They're intimately related and they overlap. And I think the smaller version or the kind of everyday version has the larger version in it, but we're not always aware of it in a sense.
Yeah, the word that comes to mind as you were speaking is a disenchantment.
Yeah.
You can think of the process of becoming bored because there are things which perhaps at one point in one's life did engage you, but as you proceed along the way, that initial attraction or resonance sort of falls off, and it can be kind of felt acutely if, as an adult, you go and say you have to babysit for a 5-year-old or something like that, and there's a certain level of delight in interacting with the child, but their fascination with certain things can at times be almost marvelous when contrasted with the mundane aspect that they present to yourself as an adult. But you know that you yourself were once similarly enthralled by precisely such simple matters, right? So that kind of throws it into a stark relief how that transpires. Now, there's the notion that the legacy of the scientific revolution is a fundamentally disillusioning legacy and a disenchanting legacy. And I think we mentioned this the other time. I'm thinking of that quote again from Hamlet. Look you this sky, this brave o'erhanging firmament, this most excellent canopy, fretted with golden fire, it seemeth to me no other thing than a foul and pestilent congregation of vapor. So we've become maybe even bored with nature and as such the world altogether. And if we accept that Shakespeare could be used as like a compass of the emergence of modernity, do you think it would be fair to say in turn that boredom is something which is distinctive of modernity, or distinctive in a special way. And of course, then there's the issue of post-modernity, and how do you, split that conception. So, I mean, what do you say? Do you think boredom is something distinctive of our age? Is, and if so, what is it about our age that sets it apart from the prior?
Yes, yeah. To go back to what you're saying about science quickly, one of the things that I did in my own research was to looking at specifically the question of the modern subject, and tracing that back until the moment that, for me, and it had to be a personal thing because I think it's such a difficult question to begin with. For me, the modern subject emerges in a way that I could understand it and I could build upon. And for me, that was Galileo. And the moment that Galileo looks through the telescope, and anything that happened before, all the speculations of Copernicus are put into perspective. We can literally see that we're on a hunk of rock. We're moving through space. There are certain things that become irrefutable. And I think it takes our culture until the end of the 18th century to really come to terms with what that meant. And so this is when you have the emergence of what is considered modern boredom. And the leading scholar in this area, Elizabeth Goodstein, has argued that boredom is a modern phenomenon. And it really emerges with modernity proper and the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, which is actually when we see the word emerging in literature and in philosophy. And I do believe that. I do think it's true. And I think one of the key things that it gets linked to quite powerfully is consumer culture. And when you were talking about the relationship between you and the person, the child that you're babysitting, I think that's a problem. Consumer culture teaches us to always be looking for the new, to always expect entertainment, and never to be happy with what we have. And so I think this is where boredom is quite common. And since I started this project, every time I tell people about it, they seem surprisingly fascinated, more so than I would have expected before I did it.
I'm just thinking about the ambiguity. There's an ambiguity to me as to what's happening here. There's sort of two moments. One being the question of how science and the manner in which our perspective shifts as a consequence of science, how that leads to modern boredom. And then there's the question of consumerism and the drive to constantly be entertained and so forth. So to take it one step at a time, with respect to the first, there's in turn two questions that can be asked, right? The one question is, does this shift in perspective in fact condemn us to a crisis of significance? That is, are we capable of living a fulfilled existence in a universe whose constitution suggests that we are utterly unimportant? Or is that a contrast between the extent of the cosmos and our almost infinitesimality, if you like, simply something which we could not or cannot bear as human beings? Right. So then that leads to the second. The second question is, if you look at things like entertainment and consumerism and so forth, and scintillation and distraction, if we are incapable of confronting the implications of our insignificance, perhaps the distraction becomes necessary for our own psychological survival. To be clear, I don't personally think that that's what's going on, but it seems that that's certainly a line which one might take how would you respond to those reflections?
Yeah, I think you're drawing out exactly a lot of where my argument went and where my thinking about this comes from. Um, I mean, the natural link for me, not to keep going back to Galileo, but between Galileo and the modern emergence of kind of a modern culture is Descartes. And Descartes looks at Galileo, looks at his discoveries, and in a sense, his response to that is the cogito, to look to himself, in a sense. And I'm oversimplifying, obviously, for the sake of our discussion, but I think there's a definite sense in which if everything outside becomes too overwhelming and it's difficult, then there's a turn towards the self. And consumer culture does this really well. It teaches us very well to constantly look inside ourselves, see that emptiness, and then try to fill it from the outside. So we buy things. And I think, especially with the difficulties in the 19th century, and what I've always found really curious about the kind of the death of philosophy and the rise of quote unquote theory, and that you see, I think, a struggle against this. And you have certain people who give answers to the questions you're asking. And the one I'm thinking of is Nietzsche, who sees the idea of the will, of the subjective will, as the means of responding to what we're being handed, this level of insignificance. And this is one of the reasons why I based my idea of the will to boredom off of that, is the idea of seeing boredom through that lens and seeing it as something that is not just an end in itself. It's in a sense a test of subjective will. It asks us whether or not we're willing to go beyond it. And when you're not, then consumer culture, again, is right there, and it sells you anything that you need to for short-term interest. But for long-term interest and for like true accomplishment for yourself, I think there needs to be more. And I think our entire society, I mean, as kind of a weird statement, I don't actually believe in postmodernism per se. I think that it's an artificial division that we've made to make it seem like something different is happening than has happened before. But I see the two bleeding into each other way too much, personally.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I just coughed. Sorry. Can you clarify? You say the two things bleeding into each other. Do you mean modernity and post-modernity because it's an artificial distinction? Is that what you meant?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And I agree. I think post-modernity is really just the natural extension of what happens in modernity. So it is a fundamentally artificial distinction. I guess the parade way of saying it would be that post-modernity is the collapse of I don't know if you want to say meta-narrative or the notion that there's an underlying story which gives power and significance to our lives. All stories, or another way of putting it is that all stories have been shown to be merely stories. That narrative is no longer an adequate basis of guiding our life. An absent narrative, where we go from there. But if that's the case, then modernity represents like the last narrative before the collapse of narrative. Would you say that will be a decent way of putting it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right.
So,
Except,
go on.
I was just going to say the only thing for me is through my own work, I keep having the suspicion that this collapse was set forth in the beginning, in the 19th century. So it's just playing itself out in a sense.
So where or what about the beginning creates this collapse? I don't think it's simply the sort of like the insight. There's got to be more to it, I think, than just the insight of like the unfathomable extent of the universe, like its sheer size and our, material insignificance in the face of that size. I mean, I want to say that there's something more going on there than just that. I mean, or do you think that that's just it? We were just so blown away by the fact that the universe is enormity that that we just didn't know what to do with it, or do you think perhaps something else is afoot in like not just with like Galileo and the mathematization of nature?
I think for me, I do think that's the beginning and maybe that's the impetus, but I do agree with you that I think that there is more going on. And I think, to me at least, it really came down to a question of can we accept the definition of what it means to be, I mean, for lack of a better word, what it means to be human in the face of the kind of modern culture that has developed and that we're developing. And so trying to balance out that those scientific discoveries, the cultural advancements, all of these issues, trying to balance that out with the vision that we have of being human seems to me to be the core of the problem.
Yes, actually, as you're saying that, I'm recalled of you may be familiar with it, an essay by Wilfrid Sellars from like 1962, "Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man."
No,
Or,
actually. Okay.
well, he argues that the real problem with philosophy is in the contemporary space is to establish a relationship between what he calls the scientific image of man, which is essentially the image of man as a complex physical system, and the manifest image, which is his term, and which he defines as that sense of the human being is something which is personal, and by extension, a sense of the universe, which is personal as well. And he believes that the two can be brought into a state of conciliation. I don't want to go too far with that because it's just the distinction seems to be germane for what you're saying. It's like we have to establish a certain vision of who and what we are as human beings, and the scientific image seems to fall short because there's something egregiously unsatisfying. I mean, to me, some people claim that they're satisfied with it. Uh, and, uh, and I don't mean that when I said that it sounded like I was being flippant. Okay, I wasn't trying to sound flippant because there are people who I know who quite seriously assert that they're satisfied with themselves as, or self-conception is just a complex physical system. Um, but it seems maybe the category of the person is something which we could interrogate, which would tie us back to Descartes and the significance of the cogito. Um, I mean, what do you think? Do you have anything to say about that? And then maybe we can talk a little. We haven't even brought art into the conversation yet. We've just sort of been talking about this constellation of questions around who and what we are and how boredom arises in response to the crisis of meaning, which is precipitated by the modern and the postmodern state.
Yeah.
So,
No, in a sense, I could answer your question by leading into art because at the moment I'm teaching a first year course that covers from the beginning of cave painting up until 1800, and it's a fascinating course in the sense that it covers such a broad, huge history. But especially after you hit late medieval into Renaissance, you start seeing a different response from students who feel a greater connection. And in a sense, there's a connection to that kind of work that's actually non-existent in the work that's being produced today. And there's obvious arguments for whatever is being done today is usually not as well received as in the past because there's historicism. But at the same time, I think the type of work that's done, especially in the 19th century and before, the realism, there's certain qualities to it that definitely speak to the kind of human beings that we want to be. For lack of a better term, I'm kind of again, I feel like I'm oversimplifying it, but for the sake of it. Whereas our contemporary art has been progressively moving away from these ideals and these concepts, and it seems to be much more troubling. And this is one of the reasons why I ended up using art as a framework for my own book, because to me, it was interesting to see how the art reflected the ideas of their time and in some cases reflected back things that people didn't like. I mean, I'm thinking a lot of the Italian neorealist cinema, which all the Italians at the time hated and all the Americans loved because depressing as all hell. Great cinema, but if you're living the life of the bicycle thief, you don't want to have to go to the movies. You want to get away from it. And so art represents this strange state between getting away from something and reflecting it at the same time. And does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I know it's just, there's that, it sort of relates to the problem, the category of entertainment as well, right? In terms of how something might function aesthetically and how lots of sort of more contemporary or avant-garde art defies insertion into that category because if you take it seriously, it precipitates an engagement of these uncomfortable questions of like who and what we are as human beings. And it's interesting that your students tend to resonate with images that emerge, if I heard you correctly, from slightly earlier, where you still had a representation of ideals as to who and what we are as human beings. You could say that maybe the contemporary project is trying to deal with the possibility that there are no such ideals, that they are that pretension or fiction, and confronting that possibility.
Yes. Except for me, I would like to believe that there are those ideals there. We don't seem to have the vocabulary to talk about them in the way that we need to.
So, can you give me an example of how such a vocabulary is forged by a contemporary, by a living artist, for example?
Living artist. I think it's the example I used last time we talked about this, but the one of the key people for me is always on Kawara, Japanese artist who recently passed away. And he did a lot of amazing work with dates, date paintings. So he would just paint the date wherever he was on a canvas. He had to paint it during the day, put it in a box, and it has a really interesting effect because it's so simple. And at the same time, if you look at his date paintings from the 70s and you look at his date paintings from the 2000s, they look exactly the same. There's no idea of progress involved in it in the way that we've come to understand the concept. But there's still an idea of production and meaning. And at the same time, the meaning is treated very much like, in a sense, meaning in the modern era has to be understood, which is arbitrary. It's not inherent in the object. I can walk past 5 of his paintings and not see anything, and then see a date that jumps out at me. All of a sudden, I put all that meaning into it. And so to me, his work is a great example because it works in a vocabulary that fits the world that we live in, where we don't really believe that meaning is inherent in objects anymore. We seem to really want to, but we don't. And so we seek that meaning in other ways.
It's also interesting that you know that there's an almost antithesis struck between the notion of progress and productivity, because I think, at least colloquially, productivity and progress are conjoined, and to sort of split those apart almost creates the possibility of meaning outside of situation historically. That sounds sort of weird, but what actually called to my mind as you were speaking was I was just sort of free associating here, but I was thinking of the famous sort of sand mandalas that some Tibetan Buddhists they'll spend a great deal of time constructing this elaborate mandala, and then do it.
Yeah.
They had, it's a spiritual exercise, but it sort of almost something similar, I think, is happening there in terms of confronting certain aspects of reality. But that may be just something of a digression. I'm sorry.
No, actually, it's funny because I've studied Buddhism a lot, and especially when I was younger. And when I was doing my research, it kept dawning on me that especially a lot of the Zen Buddhist philosophies, there's an interesting correlation or relationship between boredom and meditation. Not one that I was able to get into in the book because it would be too complex, but enough that I put in one footnote just to kind of indicate that to me there seems to be something there where meditation, for those people who've tried it and do it, there are moments where meditation is incredibly boring because you're just sitting there, you're trying to do something. There's supposed to be something happening, it just doesn't work. And then there are other moments when you're doing nothing, but it's a profound experience. And I think it kind of goes back to your experience with babysitting, where you could be just bored with a child because you can't understand, but then there are those moments when you can really experience and recognize that there is something more going on that just outside the vocabulary that we're used to using to judge meaning.
I mean, it also, in that latter sense that you just pointed out, at least personally, it's a real challenge to those sorts of situations are a challenge to like my ego, right? Because I have to realize that the only thing that's dividing me from being able to really engage in this experience is a commitment to certain standards of meaning, which are ultimately my standards of meaning. And I have to sort of realize their inadequacy for helping me in this context, and not just like, oh, helping me enjoy myself, but to be capable of presence for this other person. So
Yeah, exactly.
is that good? I was just going to see if that sounded coherent. That was all I was going to say.
Yeah,
So
it's really good. And this is one of this, what you're describing is exactly how I would describe my concept of the will to boredom, which I propose in the book. And this idea of you being presented with something, a situation, and your response to it tells you a lot about who you are and how you're dealing with things. And the one person I build upon a lot in terms of these theories is Walter Benjamin, who in the Arcades project talks a lot about boredom. And he talks about boredom as a threshold. And to me, I always come back to that because if you think about the moment of being bored, not as just an end, a giant wall, but as a threshold, something that you need to push through, you need to see past, then it again, as you said, it asks certain things of you. You have to look beyond the way that you experience, the way that you expect things to be, if you want to see more than what you see in front of you.
yes, absolutely. And you could also bring up, if you wanted to talk about it, and I can't, her name escapes me. I think it was, well, maybe it was a he, but the filmmaker, uh, and you talked about potatoes,
Oh,
and
yeah,
what,
Chantal Akerman.
and then, yes, and the film is about 3 hours or so, and I think he said, and what was that film?
Yeah, it was. It's called Jean Dielman, and yeah, I think it's 3 hours and 3.5 hours. It's incredibly long, and yeah, it's about the life of a housewife named Jean Dielman, and the entire title of the film is actually Jean Dielman, and then it has her address where she lives. Yeah, and one of the famous scenes in it is her peeling the potatoes, in which she peels, I think, 3 potatoes, and we watch her peel all 3 instead of the Hollywood partially peel one, cut to the last one she's done. And yeah, it's very, very meditative. I'd use, kind of Buddhist ideas there. It's very meditative to actually watch the film because we get to see, and Ackerman talked about this, we get to see her do acts in their entirety. She doesn't cut it because she wants us to know the temporality of Jeanne Dielman's life, not just, for her, the idea of living through something, through the entire thing, is vital to understanding the character and to understanding the meaning or lack of meaning involved in the process.
Yes, I think that's absolutely fantastic, right? You have to live through the whole thing, and it's amusing, how films will do things that obscure reality precisely through illusion. Uh, it's sort of in terms of like something that's going on in popular culture. This might seem almost like inappropriately uh, trivial, but there's a television series Gotham, which is purportedly the prehistory of Batman, right? And you see this young Bruce Wayne who's like 12 or 13 or something like that. And I have to tell you that one thing that has bothered me is that, and it shouldn't bother me, but it's like, well, how are they ever going to get to him being Batman? He's only 13. You don't want to look at the fact that you have to actually live through another 16 years before he comes to this, and that seems kind of silly. Maybe another like example would be like the Rocky films, right? Where you have the famous training montage and everybody gets excited watching him train over this, what is it, 2, 3, 5 minutes at most. You don't actually have to encounter what it would have been like for him to like get up for how many awful mornings when it's like 3 below zero in Philadelphia and go outside, and endure the physical training and so forth. So there's a kind of illusion there that often, perhaps innocently, is proffered by mainstream art that obscures the manner in which time itself sort of stretches and right back squarely to the question of boredom.
Exactly.
Right. And I'm thinking now we could almost talk about the painting, which is on the cover of the book by Manet, right?
The railway, yes.
And how that sort of you chose that piece. Why do you talk about that, if you like?
Yes, it was a strange choice in a sense. When I first started this project, it definitely was supposed to be much more contemporary art. I'd thought of the idea of Boredom and Art and started working on it. It started off as a PhD thesis a very long, long time ago, and so I had looked at contemporary art and contemporary artists, most of which are not talked about in the book. Um, but what bothered me was, in a sense, of tracing this back, and so going back and going back, and so for me, at least from a modern art perspective, I really look to Manet to be somebody who seemed to acknowledge the limitations of experience. And so he loved taking imagery and concepts from previous artists and reusing them, but there's always these barriers. And I've always been fascinated with them, but this was my first real exploration of what he did and his ideas. And then one of my favorite pieces has always been the railway, but it was one of those things where you just like it, and I'm sure somewhere in your mind you think you know why. But as this project came about, I got more and more obsessed with it, and it became the linchpin for me. And not because I've had this question many times. I'm not claiming that Manet is actually presenting boredom per se. He might be, but he seems to be presenting a particular experience of modernity that involves a whole series of things, including technology, the relationship between the railway, the train, and the subject. And the woman holds the book. She has a dog, talking about the novel, talking about all these things, watching a child who seems to be looking. And there's a great quote by a 20th century art historian who says that the hero of this painting is the smoke, or the mist in the background. Because as you note when you really think about it, this woman is not sitting in a train station. She's sitting in, someone's backyard, actually. And so the train is just passed. And so you don't even see the train. So it seems to be about waiting, but waiting for something that we're not exactly sure. She doesn't seem to be waiting for a train because it just passed. And so this is where that seemed to be a great point of starting my ideas and talking about some of the ideas of boredom as not just an end in itself, but something that could open up other possibilities. So that's where I was thinking.
Right. It's amazing how much is intersecting there. I mean, you can almost sort of introduce the notion of the project, right? And all the different projects which are implicit in the painting, right? The project of technology, the project of the novel, why, all these things and how projects relate to our identity. And then the project, by extension, can be seen as an obsession with accomplishment and the particular sense of accomplishment that we inherit, the project, the progress, and so forth. And maybe the ultimate inadequacy of that is what gives rise to what we've been discussing at length here.
And another key thing for me, I think in the long run, was looking at the Manet as an example of a truly modern perspective, in which the painting itself, when it hangs on the wall and when you go by it, it just, it's one of those things where when you go to a museum and you see the work, you get these experiences that sometimes you wouldn't have known otherwise. And for me, walking past it, I just suddenly had the vision of, her being in a train window and just, treating the gallery almost like the train, because the woman looks at us, but she doesn't seem interested in us. She doesn't seem to recognize us. There seems to be a very banal attitude to her. And it got me really curious about that.
Yes, that sort of the way in which the dominance of her interiority, right? She's clearly seeing the outward world and we out here who are peopling it. But despite that spectacle, is yet still arrested by whatever is unfolding in her own subjectivity.
Exactly.
And that there is, the crisis of solitude which runs through our age, bowling alone and all the rest of it. So, well, this is maybe sort of to introduce in almost an ad hoc fashion another element, but how would you say that capitalism fits into this? How does capitalism, what would you say is the relationship between, I mean, I know that's like a huge word and so forth, but we'll just start there and see what happens. How do you see that?
Yeah, it is a big word, and it's always a little difficult because I've always conceived my project in relation to capitalism and consumer culture for various, mostly obvious reasons, but it's still always, it's remained a bit of a struggle in many cases because capitalism is so vital in the way that it shapes our subjectivities. And I mean, one of the big questions I keep hearing, or the comments I keep hearing constantly in our particular day and age, is if we can conceive of any kind of a world that's outside capitalism. And for most people, they can't. It's a literal restriction. And in a sense, this idea of infinite growth that we seem to be really having problems with in our day and age again, all of this to me comes back to a lot of questions that you see going through the modernist avant-garde. And the avant-garde seems to develop as an opposition to consumer culture. And so you get this push towards non-entertainment, this push towards challenging people rather than just placating them. that we see for great different levels of success and failure depending on how you judge it. But the one quote or topic that really struck me when I was looking at this is for the Situationist International in the 1960s. There's a quote from them. I think it's one of their journals. I don't think it's actually from anyone in particular, saying that boredom is counter-revolutionary. And it's something that in my book I criticize very highly, because to me, if there's anything that stands in direct opposition to consumer culture and to the push of capitalism, it's boredom. Because in a sense, embracing boredom would really cause a lot of problems for consumer culture. If we weren't driven through boredom to do all these things, and I mean, I'm sure I'm not going to be talking to myself here when I say there are moments when you're watching TV and you realize to yourself that you hate what you're watching, but you just don't know what else to do with yourself. So you get caught up in things, right? Just because
Right.
there. And so that to me is where I started with this idea of trying to ask myself if there's a form of boredom or there's an idea of boredom that I could look to that would be on the opposite end. And this is where I came up with the idea of matching boredom and will, a will to boredom, and seeing a will to boredom very much against the visions of the situationists, and more towards someone like Benjamin and I would say the surrealists, of trying to embrace what that means and see what would come of that, to not have to be entertained and to depend upon oneself more, to push beyond what you're given.
Excuse me, I sneezed there. Right, there's a defiance.
Yes.
In a willingness to be bored. I mean, the only thing is it's almost like if you arrive there, you wouldn't actually be bored if you actually got to that state, right,
Yeah.
where you could actually be content, almost in a classical stoical sense, right? But it have the capacity. You don't just suddenly wake up and have the capacity to be content. There is a process and a struggle and a pushing through to that place, and that may be the will, right,
Yes.
to which you're referring, and part of that will, I think, is maybe reconstituting how we conceive of ourselves, which feeds back into defining what capitalism and consumerism has to tell us about who and what we are.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
You know, I'm sorry, I was just laughing because I was like, you could use this whole motif to argue in a creative misinterpretation that Gladiator is an anti-capitalist exhortation to word, right? Because there's that scene where the arena where he's like, "Are you not entertained?" But anyway, sorry, that was just
No.
side. But go on. Yeah.
I was just going to say the linchpin for me is always that idea of, and this is to me the answer of what we are being asked in relation to capitalism is whether or not we're willing to take what we're given or go beyond. And as long as we're willing to take what we're given, and this is the kind of will that I've been looking at a lot in not only this project but a lot of projects, because I've noticed that a lot of the people in my lives, there are people who cannot conceive of anything that they're not actually given. And it's not a criticism on them, it's just the fact that this is how they perceive the world. They're given things and they do what they can with what they're given. Whereas there's another group of people who are always trying to push those boundaries and see what else can be made, what else can be created. And this gets back to Nietzsche's concept of will as a form of, it's a creative thing. It has to be creative or it's not truly will for Nietzsche.
Well, I guess the rejoinder there, which is forthcoming, and I'm not asking it, I'm sort of asking it out of obligation, right? Is
No.
How do you deal with the manner in which someone like Nietzsche
Yeah.
is then used by certain specious political elements, right? You're talking about exalting the will as a creative power to defy the valuations which are being imposed upon us.
Yes. Yeah.
So then the danger arises that you are entering into a new scape without any kind of sound or compass, because the will can be directed wheresoever. How how do you deal with that and concern, anxiety response?
Yeah. I think the simplest answer to that is, and in a sense, actually, I feel like I should step back a bit, because when we were talking before about what science has done and what modern culture has done in terms of our relationship to ourselves, to our species, I think one of the hardest consequences of the scientific discoveries we've made is the fact that we have lost sight of any objective truth. And everything in science and everything in our lives keeps demonstrating how little objectivity there actually is to deal with. And so many people have lost a belief in God. Many people have lost belief in anything except for their own subjective needs and wants, which is, again, where capitalism and consumer culture step in, because it's very happy to play with that. And it becomes a form of objectivity, just temporary objectivity. We supplement this need by buying and consuming objects, quite literally. And for people like Nietzsche, and I would I would say that Nietzsche, and there's a whole line of thinkers, and the surrealists were very inspired by a lot of these things as well, which is a key area of my own interest in research. There seems to be a need and a desire to define what it is that that subject is capable of, what it consists of, and not to not to conceive of a subject as something that suppresses, but that is personally able to accomplish. And when you were saying going back to the Stoics, and I would also add to that, like the Cynics, this idea in ancient thought that travels all the way up into the present of trying to find a way to really maximize what it means to be human for oneself. And unfortunately, the person to go to in all these cases is always Socrates, because Socrates was interested in making himself the best he could be. And I think that that's Nietzsche's answer in many ways. I mean, yes, his philosophy has, there's been many attempts to use it to subvert, but if you read what he talks about in terms of the will to power, he doesn't mean power over other people. It's always something very, very subjective, very personal. And it's always based on one's ability to overcome the obstacles that oneself puts in place. And so that to me is the true project, the project of the self, which is the project of modernity in many ways.
So, I mean, then how do processes like processes is such an antiseptic word, but for what I was about to ask is like, where do things like compassion or love arise if you are sort of detained by a project of the self? Are you suddenly put in a, how what happens there? How is there not like a kind of danger of a certain solipsism?
Um, there can be, but to me, I mean, all throughout at least Western history, there's definitely this push towards the idea of passion and the passions, and the idea of um, being compassionate, and that compassion playing a distinct part in one's own subjective world. And I think to all the examples that Nietzsche gives of the will to power are people who accomplish through doing things for culture and for other people. They're never people who conquer. They're never people who stick to themselves, just look out for themselves. I think that selfishness is antithetical to a true will to power. And I think we're getting much more into a very personal my territory here, but I definitely feel like when we talk about will, that will has to be something that includes a larger sense of what it means to be a subject in the world. And to be compassionate and to be open to other people is part of that process.
Well, I mean, I would just to sort of collaborate. I hope my questions didn't seem contrarian or antagonistic.
No.
But on that latter point, we could almost see another space where boredom is a kind of training ground, right? Well, we sort of had that already implicitly in the example of, taking care of a child, but part of being with other people is being with other people in the face of, at times, excruciatingly difficult experiences. The experiences of death and disease and so forth. Highly uncomfortable. And it may be that we have a natural do that, but certainly the conditioning of our culture has gone a long way to suppress or weaken that capacity. So being willing to sit there when you're bored might just be a threshold through which one has to pass, enable experience. Talking about is almost the antithesis of selfishness. Then yeah, and then of course we start asking, like, what, just to bring it full circle. Then you ask, like, well, what is the self anyway? Yeah. And the fact that our identity is necessarily social, I think, sort of points. I think that's a powerful the solipsistic line is that we are fundamentally social, and even how we understand ourselves, and so there's an incoherence to severing our I from the thou, as it were. So, and it's curious. I was reading this recently. This sort of stuff recently, but one of the things that characterizes political theory, right, in the 18th century and the 17th century is this idea, this particular weird anthropology you find in people like Hobbes, where you have the idea that we as human beings are really solitary and actively antagonistic, but that doesn't actually seem to work at all. Even in just a very, basic English empirical kind of way. No, people they're not actually like that, and so that's actually ultimately very encouraging, I think.
Yeah, and I think that to get back to one of the things we started with, the idea of science, I think one of the big mistakes that we make too often is that we're getting so advanced with a lot of our technologies and scientific discoveries that we seem to assume that we can answer all questions. And it's both the cause of great joy in our age and patting ourselves on the back, but it seems to also be the cause of a lot of our problems, because we seem to want to have something that has meaning and we can't find it. All we find is answers, not meaning. And in what you were talking about in the 18th century, I mean, you're talking about the age of Enlightenment, in which we thought we were so enlightened. And in a sense, what you get is a whole series of things that develop out of that as a response to that attempt to quote unquote enlighten. And so the Enlightenment actually my word. It brings about something that actually moves away from it, but accomplishes it in a different way, in a way that maybe we couldn't have conceived before. And this is another reason why I constantly do work with art, because to me, art is one of those ideal spaces, and one of the spaces that still functions very well in our contemporary world, to challenge the boundaries that we're constantly told we can't go beyond.
Yes, and well, we could sort of transition from there to the question of how. Well, the question of, well, how does art remain relevant? You know, and within the space of this conversation, the answer to that is, well, it's relevant because it's challenging our before a very constraining sense of values, right? So it's theoretically obvious, but what isn't necessarily as obvious is how do you get people to engage with that subversion? And all of a sudden we find ourselves in the uh, problematic of pragmatism, where you're like, oh, well, now we're being practical, and now we have to sort of set ourselves up with a specific political project and so forth. And it seems like a kind of almost like vicious circle, you know. But how do you respond to that?
For me, I think that our biggest problem today, in terms of specifically art, is that we actually don't really take it seriously anymore. We seem to treat it as this little sideshow and minimize it. And even worse, from my perspective, we trying our very best to turn it into a truly commercial endeavor. And there's a lot of artists who probably disagree with my statement, but who I believe are pushing towards opening up questions of money and finance, because that's what the belief is. That's what they think the value is. When we talk about value, primarily we're talking about financial value. And a lot of this is because of government funding and other agencies and processes and structures that impose ideas onto it. But I think for me, the artworks that I looked at in my book and that I study just generally in my research are ones that, for me, I believe demonstrate a form of importance that's not, again, to use the same terminology I have been, not given to us, but that in a sense is asking us to move beyond something. And that, again, is the linchpin of art and art's value, from my perspective, is that it has to ask us to do something, it has to ask us to move beyond. We don't live in an age in which we really want to do that anymore.
And, you know, I mean, you're sort of left, I think that where this leaves me is it sort of becomes almost, maybe this is, you know, it's sort of the existentialist challenge, right? That right, you have to do with your own life. You have to constitute the meaning in your own life in a way which is consonant with this broader vision that you're articulating. Um, and it's almost as if you have to surrender the idea that you're going to get anywhere with it.
I think that's a beautiful way of putting it.
And you know, and that's, I think maybe that's, you know, what we all have to sort of ultimately say is like, you know, you're going to do what you're going to do, and insofar, you know, again, it's almost stolen or cynical in the old sense of the word cynic, right?
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, for me, one of the key artists that I always go back to, in the sense that you're talking about, is Marcel Duchamp. Is probably the cornerstone of most of my research, because for him, and I mean his most famous creation, the ready-made art. For him, the object is something that it sits there and it has presence in the gallery. But the truth of the matter is the quote unquote art of the art project is something that we as viewers have to put into it. And we're given all the tools to do that because it's sitting in a museum. So we're supplied with that ability. But at the same time, it's just as easy for it to not be art. It can actually go either way. That's the beauty of what he did. And in that sense, it is coming down to a question of will. We have to will this to be an object of significance. We have to put meaning into it. And so, yeah, surrender ourselves to that, to use your term, and put the meaning in ourselves. And I think that's the linchpin.
Yes, and I think we should probably leave it there, from the standpoint that we could like open up in a whole other set of questions, like what happens to art when you put it in a museum and that sort of thing, right? And then as you were saying that, I read your other book is Marcel Duchamp, Étant, donnés, right? Isn't that given, be, what have you? So same theme there. So thank you so much, Julian.
No, thank you. This has been enjoyable.
Again. And thanks to everybody who's been listening or who will listen. And we'll have this up here hopefully by the end of the day on YouTube. So thanks again. You still there?
Yes. Sorry, could you repeat what you just said? It got cut off.
Oh, I said, well, I just said thank you again.
Oh,
and
okay.
We'll go ahead here. And it should be up by the end of the day on YouTube. So,
well, thank you again.
I'll try and put links. You're welcome. Thank you. I'll talk to you later.
Bye.